well, we're here today for VSC Freestyle, and we're really excited to have Kat Mañalac here
Thank you for having me.
From Y-Combinator, startup powerhouse within the powerhouse, and really excited to have you and just talk to you a little bit about your experience. So much of it relates to what we do here at VSC, and so we're really curious about so many things. So might as well just jump in. First off, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you get to where you are now?
Sure. So right after college, I started at Wired magazine, and I was there on the sort of brand strategy side. So I worked everywhere where you see Wired off the page, the Wired store, the Wired home. I worked with the editorial team to make that happen. And while I was there, I got to know the founders of Reddit really well. So at the time, Condé Nast had recently acquired Reddit, and they were just a team of 5. And I ate lunch with them every day. And so when, I think I was at Wired for 4 years, and I started thinking about what I wanted my next step to be, I talked to Alexis Ohanian, the founder of Reddit, and he said, and I think when you meet startup founders, they all start to become startup pushers. And he was like, you should start your own company. Or he was like, you should work at a startup. And so he started introducing me to all these founders. And I started interviewing, and then midway through the process, he goes, I'm starting my own fund, I have a nonprofit. Would you come on board and help me, as head of operations or communications, whatever you want to call yourself? And so I worked with Alexis on his fund and nonprofit for a couple years directly after Wired.
Wow! And what were those two experiences? What particular experiences or skills did you pick up along the way that really got you, sort of tuned you into this role at YC?
So I've always been very interested in how technology impacts culture. And so I think being at Wired was one of the best sort of educations for me. I was introduced to a lot of smart people, both on the editorial side and the people we worked with. I got to work with a lot of startups, a lot of media labs at the MIT Media Lab. I worked with a lot of research groups that were building really cool products and figuring out how to showcase them. So was always kind of tuned into what was happening next, what was going to be, a big, impact in the future. And so I think, that got me introduced to startups fairly. I guess this was like around 2007, 2008, and so reasonably early on. And then working with Alexis was incredible because he introduced me to the whole YC community. A lot of his portfolio companies were YC companies. We helped them, a lot of them, with their public launches, with their communication strategy, social media strategy. And Alexis, I think, is one of the best startup storytellers in the world. So he's also, and I think, Reddit is now one of the top, 5 or 10 sites in the US. And so I think he's also one of the best community builders. And so getting to work directly with him and learning about the skills that it took to build both community and to tell startup stories in a compelling way, I think was additionally one of the best possible educations I could get. And that really set me up for the work that I do at YC.
That's amazing. So before Wired, how did you even get interested in, would that be journalism at that point or media, or tell us about your background?
Sure, so I went to Northwestern University and I started out as journalism. So I thought I was gonna, work on the editorial side, and then a couple years in I was like, I'm not as passionate about this side as I am about, the creative writing. And so I ended up getting into film and comm studies. So I thought I was gonna move to LA right after college and work on the, film, TV production side of things. Then I came back. I'm originally from the Bay Area. I came back literally just to say hi to my mom on my way to, I had an apartment in LA set up, but no job. And she slipped my resume to a Google recruiter who said, oh, we have this 6-month temp job. Would you be interested? And I was like, I'll stay for 6 months. And then I learned so much there, but I thought, this really isn't what I wanted to do long term. But I saw the Wired job open up. And I was like, I love Wired. I love the way that they cover technology. I would stay in the Bay Area for that. And so I got the job at Wired, and so I sort of fell into it by accident. I never actually anticipated being here. And so it just was it was both luck being at the right place at the right time, and then also just following that interest in technology and culture.
That's awesome. Go Mom.
I know, right?
Mom's
slipping resumes into
That's awesome. And so at YC, could you describe sort of what's your really what do you see as your real job there? What's your day like? What's a typical day? I know every day is different, but in general, how would you say like your key functions there are?
So I started out as YC in 2013 as YC's first director of outreach, and that meant outreach to applicants. So when I started, Paul and Jessica, the founders of YC, said, we've grown totally organically up until this point. We've never done any marketing. We get most of our applications through Hacker News. Yeah. And so they said, if we had one person, like a growth team of one, thinking about how to access smart people who haven't thought about applying to YC or haven't even started thinking about starting a startup and convincing them to, what would that be like? So I came on board as their first director of outreach. And also got connected to YC through Alexis, so that's how I got introduced to Paul and Jessica. And so that was really my role, is to figure out like where do we find smart founders around the world, and how do we get them to apply. And so I became a full-time partner the next year, which means all the partners are involved with reading applications. We probably get about 7,000 applications now per batch.
Wow.
Recruiting founders to apply. We all are part of the interview process and the investment process. And then each of us helps advise the companies in specific ways. And what I help a lot of the companies with in the batch are helping them prepare for their public launches. So most of the founders we fund are first-time founders. It's the first time they ever have to talk about their product publicly. And so we help them figure out what is the best, most succinct way to talk about what you're doing that'll be compelling to the public, compelling to press. And then later in the batch, we help them really figure out how to tell that story to investors. So that's something I help with a lot for the companies in the batch. And then generally help with everything external facing at YC. So we do college tours, we do events like the Female Founders Conference, we do a lot of content on our blog and video, and so working with folks on our team to kind of put that all on, to kind of share what we teach at YC more publicly.
Awesome. And so when you started and the goal was to find out a way to be sort of a growth team, what were the ideas that worked well and what were the ideas that didn't work so well?
I think one of the things, so if we looked at the data, and the data shows like the top way that people hear about YC is through our alumni. So one of the things that we thought about was how do we tell our alumni stories better? How do we help them figure out how to tell their stories? And so because we really think that that's the most important thing that we do, is that we help produce great companies that can then stand on their own and speak for us. And so I think that was something that we've been trying to do, telling their stories through blog posts and video, and then helping them with press as often as we can. I think leaning on that alumni community and empowering them to recommend founders to us has been great. Then we do open office hours, which I think has been great. One of our partners, Michael Seibel, said, I'd love to see more Black and Latino founders apply. And he just put out a blog post and said, we're doing open office hours with Black and Latino founders, and in about a week, less than a week, we had over 600 people sign up for them. Wow. And most of those founders had never touched base or applied to YC before. So it just took saying that we were interested to get that interest, inbound. And so I think those are awesome things that we've done. A lot of the international tours. People used to think YC didn't fund international startups. So breaking down some of those myths, I think, has been a huge part of my job. And then I'm trying to think of the things that haven't worked. We're trying to figure out still. For me, it's a huge passion point of mine. We do the Female Founders Conference, and about 900 women come from around the world. And it's a conference where all the speakers on stage are women telling their stories and like the successes they've had and how they've done it. Showcase the fact that it can be done. There are a lot of women successfully building companies, but only so far about 13 to 15% of the founders that apply are women. So I'm still trying to figure out what are those channels that we haven't accessed yet, how to convince more women to apply, or how to convince more women to start companies. Yeah. And so that's something I'm continually working on.
Awesome. We've got some thoughts for that.
Okay, I'd love to.
Shout out to Liz Gore. She'll be helpful on that. In terms of like your role, I guess first of all, just explaining the scale of YC is pretty impressive. So, I mean, the idea that 7,000, so it's 14,000 companies apply every year, would that be?
Yeah.
Okay. And how, like, what's the geographic split on that? Is it?
Mostly, so it's U.S. is probably the largest represented, then Canada, or actually now it's U.S. then India,
Okay.
then Canada, UK, then it's a pretty, then it kind of trails off.
Okay.
But we found last year we visited 13 different countries, and we started to see spikes in applications from those countries like Nigeria, India increased, Argentina. And so it's becoming more and more international. And last winter's batch, right after that tour, 40% of the companies we funded were international.
Wow.
So it's getting certainly more diverse geographically.
Right. And I noticed a lot at the demo day, quite a few companies from India and from Africa.
Yes.
Which is
exciting.
Amazing. Yeah. And also female founders from Africa and India.
Yes.
So that's very cool. So tell me about. So I guess on the side of publicity and storytelling, there's so many companies there now. You must have built some pretty good systems for helping them. And we watched one of your videos. I think we all checked it out online. But maybe just if you can give us a quick and dirty on like how do you help them prepare for that essentially?
Yeah. So I do usually at the beginning of every batch. Our batches are 3 months long. And at the beginning of the batch, I'll do just a really brief presentation on like recommendations, and then each company sits down with their group partners and goes into more depth. But basically, what we really try to help companies with is like, how do you figure out what that one sentence is, that one compelling jargon-free sentence is that you can tell someone in an elevator, you can tell an investor without their eyes glazing over.
Yeah.
You can it doesn't need to be long or complicated, and I think. We always say start with what. What is it? Really simply, because a lot of founders are really verbose. They're very, super ambitious people wanting to solve big problems, so they'll start with the why first. So they'll say like, my father was a cow farmer in Pakistan, and before he even gets to what it is, like the audience is like, what is he talking about? So I always say just start with what it is first, and then you can get to that context. So that might sound obvious, but sometimes we look at applications and it, gets paragraphs in before you figure out what it is.
Sure.
So we figure out, what is that short jargon-free sentence? It should be something that your grandmother or grandfather can repeat at a dinner table, because we think the best companies, kind of grow by word of mouth. So I tell them, if you think of all the things that you use day to day, Facebook, Uber, you probably heard about it from a friend. Or someone that you knew and they just told you. And so how do you make your company something that can be communicated that simply? And so we really kind of work with them on that, and then help them. The group partners will help them with I have sort of a list of frequently asked questions that startups get asked by launch press. That's pretty basic. It's like who you are, what you do, how it works, why it's better than what's currently in the market. And I think when YC started in 2005, every single startup that came out of YC was covered in the press, because it was a rare thing for startups to launch. But now I'm guessing someone at TechCrunch gets tens, if not hundreds, of pitches a day.
Yeah.
So you have to build a pitch that's compelling enough. But we help them figure out what are succinct ways to answer those frequently asked questions, and then we kind of help introduce them and try to, and it's the same for demo day, right? You have 2.5 minutes to present what you've built, and you're presenting alongside 100 other companies. So the pitch has to be just compelling and succinct enough for someone in the audience to remember it.
And so, as someone who's going to look at the applications, so then if this was me, and I'm not saying that you do this. If it was me, I would also probably weigh companies that already have a simple message higher than ones that I got to do a lot of heavy lifting on.
Yes.
I don't know. What do you like? How is that? Is that part of it?
So we really think that if you've thought deeply about an idea, you can explain it really simply and with less words. So yes. So when we're looking at an application, we really appreciate when they can just say, the answer to the first question, what are you making? What are you building? It's just one sentence. And then of course you can get into the nitty-gritty and the technology later. But we're reading thousands of these applications a year, and so how do you make so that we can understand in the first couple sentences that we read.
Perfect. And so give me some examples of, and I've totally noticed this at the demo day, but give me an example of like some of the one-liners, some of your favorite or funny one-liners.
My favorite one from the last batch was Fitbit for cows.
Yes.
Yes. And I know that it's controversial using the X, you know, the Uber for X, or the Airbnb for X kind of construction. But the thing is that it really paints a picture quickly. So if you have a really good kind of parallel to draw, then sometimes I'm just like, just do it. So Fitbit for cows really like lodged itself. Like when I read that on the application, I was like, I gotta read more. I was like, this is fascinating. Like I want to know the backstory. Like why do cows need Fitbit? Like I need to understand. And that's what we say. We say when you pitch, and this is what we do over and over, like every other week at YC, when you meet with your group, they have a chance to pitch their company. And if you pitch, you give your one-liner, and the person doesn't respond to the question, like you should tweet that one-liner. So if I say to you, my company's changing we're changing the like relationship between communication and society, and like if that person like responds and is like, oh cool, thanks, then you're like, okay, I'm not being clear enough. They should ask a real question as a follow-up. Okay. And then the other person, the person that you're pitching to, should have an idea in their mind of like what they need to build to replicate. So like changing the relationship between communication and society could be like Twitter, it could be the New York Times, it could be anything. Right. But like Fitbit for cows is pretty
very
clear.
Specific.
Yeah, it's pretty, and I love that one. So that is stuck in my head. And like Palantir for potatoes. Okay. Was a company, Raptor Maps. They did like farming data. So it's like it to me, even though it uses that X for Y construction, it really stuck in my head. Right. And so I think that those end up sort of being the most memorable and my favorite. There's a company. So yes. So
that's awesome. I've got maybe it's because the companies we've worked with are further along, and they're getting guidance from maybe some VCs already, or it's just a personal preference. But I've found that some companies' founders do not want to have the X for Y.
Yes.
And it's maybe.
And it doesn't always work.
It doesn't always work, but it seems like a more of a principle issue. That there was this idea that back in the day, Apple didn't say they were the Microsoft, but for everyone. I don't know. Like,
yeah.
And I think personally, I just think it's kind of it's an antiquated concern. And for startups, like you just have to fight your way to the table in any way you can into people's conscious.
Yeah, and so I'm not sure that I would say, oh, this is how you should pitch for all companies, this is how you should pitch to press. But I think when you're at Demo Day, there's 100 companies. If there's a really pithy, memorable way to describe what you're doing, I'd say go for it. Yeah.
Okay. And did you find that that's also with the data, like Fitbit for cows? I feel like when I was in the audience, people were laughing. Yeah. People were excited. Like they may not invest in it, but they remember it.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So the recall seemed to be high.
Yes.
Is that what you find that like the ethic, your approach is actually proven with the data then, or?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like if you notice like. And this is especially true of press, right? If you notice like the companies that are written about at Demo Day and like those like top 10 lists, it ends up always being the ones with those really like pithy description taglines. I think it's just like lodging themselves in people's mind. So yeah, I don't think it correlates with investment necessarily, because it's like if someone in the audience doesn't care about hardware or ag tech, it's like that it's not going to help. Right. But if someone is, then that'll certainly be memorable.
Got it. Makes sense. And so, I guess as you guys have, what has been sort of your favorite experiences at YC? Like, if you look back and say, this particular experience I worked with, either behind the scenes or before demo, what's been the most rewarding thing for you, the most exciting, memorable?
I mean, one of the most exciting stories that has happened while I was at YC was probably, there was a company that entered YC as a blood pressure monitoring app, right? And it was doing okay, it was growing decently, but I think the founders realized it wasn't growing quite as quickly as they wanted to. So they were doing side projects on the side, and one weekend they just released a link to their friends, and they said, hey, if you text this number, we can make anything happen, like magic. And one of their friends posted that to Hacker News, and someone posted it to Reddit, and overnight 40,000 people signed up. And they were like, oh my God, what do we do? We can't like support 40,000, should we shut it down? And we were like, no, you've like, you've found something that people really want. Like some people are connecting with this. And it was just so exciting to see that team, respond really quickly and grow this business out of like, basically, it was all during a batch. And so it was just an exciting process to watch. And then, and they had really, Wire did a really funny video on them where they tried to order everything from like weed to burritos to like a mariachi band or whatever, and tigers. And it was just fun to see that story blow up. And that company, start to figure out, okay, like here are all the challenges here. And I visited their office last week. They have an office in Manila, and I visited it. And it was just so cool to see how big they've gotten and how well they're doing. And so that's been one of my favorite kind of company stories. It was just such a wild pivot, and those don't often happen. And then I just love reading applications. I think it's like having, someone has, I think it was Jared, one of our partners, that described it as like having access to a crystal ball. And someone on Hacker News, we released our data from the past 8 years of applications, and someone on Hacker News compared it to Google Trends, and it turns out that we're about 18 months earlier than Google Trends. So we start seeing trends emerge 18 months before they start becoming mainstream. And so I just think that's so exciting to see, that we get to see like things kind of develop a little bit before the mainstream.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So
we'll just be driving in Wisconsin and see Fitbit for cows.
18
months from now.
Yeah, and I just think it's in 2011, for example, we saw a ton of Bitcoin-related applications, and then we saw a huge dive in Bitcoin-related companies, and then everyone for a while was building, stuff on top of Slack. Like after Magic, we saw a huge increase in applications from basically chatbots.
Right.
So chatbots became the huge thing, and so it's kind of cool to see that develop. And we never have a real, we don't ever, sometimes we put out a request for startups. So if you're working on a, desalination, a water startup, we'd love to see you apply, but we never have quotas for anything.
Right.
Because we think some of the best ideas are things that we would never think of, and everyone applying, we just get to see what some of the smartest and most creative people in the world are thinking about.
Right.
So it's kind of, I love that process, because it's you get to see some really wild stuff.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
And so if you look back now at where you are now, and asked yourself, or I had the chance 10 years ago to develop certain skills.
Yes.
Whether high school, college, what have you, what would you have done differently?
So I think, I don't think actually my coworkers know this, so if I could choose, if I could choose a team to be on at YC, I would choose a software team. And the software team has been described as YC's secret weapon. I think the reason we've been able to scale like we have been is because of software. The software that they've built, and it's mostly internal, it's never seen publicly. And it helps us read and process applications much more quickly. It helps us track the companies. Now there are 3,500 founders and 1,500 plus companies, and it helps us track all of them more easily, and it will ping us if we haven't talked to certain founders in a while. It's really smart, everything that they've built, and it helps us build a community. We have something called Bookface, which is Facebook meets LinkedIn meets Quora for all of our founders to ask each other questions and to connect, and so our software team is so great, and I guess isn't a huge surprise since a lot of them, were part of the YC community before. Yeah. And so I would have learned code. I know HTML, CSS, and I'm actually learning Python right now. We have an app in Dispatch called Pi, and it's actually great. If anyone wants to learn, it's such a simple, it feels like you're playing a game. But I would definitely learn all of that, and I think it's an exciting team to be on. And we've actually built a bot that reads applications as well as a human YC alumni.
Whoa.
So my job could be automated. Like a huge part of it could be automated at some point in the future. And we, we're not using it right now, really. We're just sort of testing it against, just to see how well it works. But it's just so interesting, some of the things that they're working on.
That's amazing. So, and yeah, I don't know if many people know that you guys have such a powerful software
It's
team.
a really small team. It's like under, maybe like 5 people, maybe 4, and they're growing. They're adding a couple people. But yeah, it's not, and people always ask, I talked to one of our software engineers, Kadrin, she said, people always ask me, why does YC have a software team? Because I don't think any other, or not many other investment companies have a dedicated team of software people.
And that's awesome. And how many people now are there full-time at YC?
There are 46. So when I started, there were maybe less than a dozen. And so we've grown quite a bit in the past 4 years.
And then how, like, in general, what's the sort of revenue model to support that kind of a staff? Is it the traditional venture model?
So YC started out as funded by its founders, and then and then I guess the model is like through exits, and YC will continue. But for now, a couple years ago we raised the YC Continuity Fund,
right?
And so it is like traditional venture model.
Right. The management fee pays for it. Okay.
Yes.
Got it. That's really powerful. So now back on the side of software, one of the biggest assets that I think has been reported on YC and that I think people know is that the power of its network itself, just all the companies and how they can create, in many ways, an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Customers, clients, team. So it seems like I would guess that a lot of your software team also helps on that kind of the power of building, harnessing this community.
Yes.
And the founders get access to that kind of. Is that sort of an area that they are getting open access to as well?
Yeah, so we, and that's, Bookface is really like the platform that we've built to make it easy to build that community online at least. And, it's really cool to see every day, you see a ton of posts by founders asking for introductions, asking for like, oh, does anyone know, a content, marketing content writer or that we can hire, or they'll say like, I'm having problems with my, AWS, like can someone help me? And they all jump in and really help. And starting a startup is so hard that I think it just makes it that much easier for you to have a whole network of people who are helpful and want you to succeed. And what's really cool is that if you're a B2B company selling to startups and you go through YC, usually you can get your first 50 to 100 customers through the YC network itself, if not the batch. Like the batch, we tell people who are selling specifically to startups, we're like, you should be getting, all of your first customers from this batch. There are 100 other companies that you should be using you.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that's interesting about sort of software as being one of the skills.
Yeah.
And sort of, I know that.
And data. I think the data we have is so interesting. Like we have now someone who on our admissions team, Fred Benenson, who came from Kickstarter, who analyzes the data on applications, and I think that stuff is so interesting. And so that's like, I think that would be a particularly interesting use of skills there.
And so let's talk a little bit about data, but also part of your job is storytelling, is working with the press.
Mm-hmm.
How have you seen the landscape of PR, media relations, how have you seen it change over the last couple of years, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough because I think people still remember the time when, every YC company at the batch was covered, but now that there are 130 and that there are, hundreds, at least tens of startups launching every week, that it's really tough to get eyeballs. It's tough to get people interested in you. And so, we always tell folks, like, no one is, you are not entitled to a story. It's like business development, right? So it's like you have to build those relationships over time. You have to really, focus on building a great product, right? That's going to speak for itself to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've seen that it has been harder to get, attention from a lot of folks just because they get, hit constantly. And yeah, I think there has been a little bit, in the past couple years, a little bit of a growing skepticism, right, around tech in certain, by certain publications, and I think it's just, maybe people get exhausted by it's like they hear so much about tech. It's like there's I think that that I've seen a little bit more skepticism from press, and that's fine. I think that's the natural course of things. I think as industries mature.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think we see like a pendulum.
Yeah.
Like maybe 4 years ago, there was a huge optimism.
Yes.
Like also particular industries like hardware, for example, so much happiness, excitement. And then when some of the companies don't ship or delayed or it's a bad experience, there's been like a pendulum shift back, which I think is what we're in right now.
Yeah.
With, I mean, like look at Juicero and things like that. So we kind of see that too. It's good to hear from someone else so that we don't think we're just crazy in the box.
But I also think that, I mean, like, this is an example is like when I lived in New York and worked for the Lexus, it was 2012, and there was a whole thing like New York tech, like New York is the next Silicon Valley, and then like less than 2 years later, they're like, New York tech isn't a thing, it's over, like, no companies, billion-dollar companies came out of New York. I'm like, it's been 2 years. Like,
exactly.
you can't just like call it, it's not been long enough for them to like develop their ecosystem and have a billion-dollar company. So I think that there's just like, sometimes there's as you were saying, there's a pendulum. If they don't see immediate results or like some huge success, then it's like, this is over.
Yeah. And how much do you then, so that must be tricky because of expectations, right? Yeah. So do you, like from a tactical perspective, do you encourage these companies to pick a different day than the other one to launch? And there's so many. It's like, I mean, like I remember like we worked with Google Comms on projects with our companies, but they literally have like, I think a day, every day someone else has their day in the sun.
No, we don't, we can't necessarily. And I always say that it's really hard, especially at the really early stage for the launches, it's really hard to pick a specific date. And you really have to work with a reporter on their own timeline because the Fitbit for Cows launching is always going to lose out to like some big Uber news.
Right.
So it's like you have to be, I think, like flexible, and that's what we try to get people ready for. We're like, okay, the timeline's gonna be tough, so don't like wait on like launching a product on all of this.
Got it.
Yeah.
And do you find for early stage that exclusive is the way to go?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So for early stage, once they get to like Series A, plus, then you can start doing, maybe embargoes or, but at our stage, exclusive is probably the way to go.
Got it. And then do you guys primarily focus? I mean, I see a lot of the companies in TechCrunch.
Yes.
Is that sort of the #1 driver for those type of companies, or is it? I guess it depends on the industry too. But
yeah,
is there like a couple that you think that are always typically?
So we always recommend Product Hunt and Hacker News because that's completely and that's more community oriented, early adopters like. But and then TechCrunch is just the publication I think that it covers the most early stage launch stories, and they also have a great. Huge reach still. They're probably for that type of publication who covers launches, have the greatest reach still. Yeah. And so that's generally unless and it depends on the industry. Like sometimes we'll pitch to other publications if it makes more sense. Like for maybe for biotech, if for example we'll try stat or we'll try other things if they're looking for less of a general audience. We'll go for more, specific publications.
Got it. They may be looking for a specific enterprise customer.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's cool. That's
but we also constantly tell people that, like, press, especially at this stage, is not a sustainable user acquisition strategy, and so we're like, don't, because they're always like, oh, should I fix my servers, or like, and I'm like, don't stress about any of that. Like, this is like, you might get a spike, but it's not. You have to, at this point, you have to think about sustainable acquisition channels, and for some companies, especially consumer. It is super helpful, but we, at this point, we work with so many, B2B enterprise that it's not quite as sustainable for them. Yeah, makes sense.
And so, in terms of your personal path in life, is this, where do you see yourself 5 years from now?
Tough question.
10 years is a long time. But,
yeah. I mean, honestly, 5 years ago, I don't think I would have predicted that I would be at YC. I mean, certainly 6 years ago, I definitely wouldn't have predicted it. So it's so hard to say, 5 years from now, what I'll be doing. Like I could be at YC, but I could be totally doing something different. But maybe, I don't know. So it's hard to say, but I think we are in such an exciting environment. We're constantly seeing new things born and grow. And so I think I think of myself and probably a number of the partners I work with that like we'll all be compelled at some point to like build, a company or like build. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that I did in the future.
Okay, awesome. And you probably run through YC then?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I loved Michael Seibel, who was part of the early Justin TV team and Social Cam, and now is the CEO of YC. He always said like, oh, if I started another startup, I would definitely put it through YC. And I was like, that is probably the biggest endorsement that you could possibly have. Is that we have a lot of alumni who come back through, and they say it's helpful even the second time around.
Got it. And now YC has been doing some very interesting experiments, right, outside of what I consider traditional tech.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you guys have a basic income project going in Oakland. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of those special projects.
Yeah, so we have a nonprofit research arm that really is looking into projects that we think will be beneficial and impact the future, but are not, that have like long time horizons. So not things that we think are necessarily like venture backable startup ideas. So basic income is one of those projects, and they're looking at, they're doing a project to see if you give people like, a basic income, enough to live, healthcare, food, housing, what do those people do? Do they just spend, do they continue to work, doing other jobs? Do they just like hang out and paint, or, become poets, or, what is the path, and then what does that look like? And then OpenAI is one of the projects that's looking at creating, general AI. And the idea there is that AI, shouldn't be owned by one company, so it shouldn't be owned by necessarily Google. So they've open sourced all of, everything that they're learning. They constantly are writing and posting blog posts about it, so that the information is out there for everyone to sort of build together versus, owned by one particular company. There's HARP, which is Alan Kay's group, and they focus a lot on education and its impact, technology's impact on education. And then there's New Cities. So it's like, how do we build affordable cities where people actually want to live and build their companies, build their homes. It's a huge issue in the Bay Area, so it's something, I think also looking into like, what does it look like? Like, could we build like vibrant cities, say, in the Midwest or in the South? They're like places where I think there need to be more economic growth led by startups.
Absolutely. That's amazing. So maybe we could open it up to questions from the team. So anybody have anything to jump in on?
Yeah.
What are some, you have a lot of exposure to startups. What is your your list of like facepalm inducing like buzzwords that you just hear like over and over and over again, or like lines from like?
I mean, I think everyone. It's like disruption. At this point, it's like anything that you hear on Silicon Valley, the TV show. It's like, disrupting. Just like everyone's like blah 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 new innovations, or everyone says that they have like AI and machine learning in there, and like if you really dig into it, there's like really nothing machine learning about that company. It's just like right now, AI and machine learning is like the big buzzword. I guess. I don't know. Those are probably the big ones right now that are just like, I'm just like, oh. Yes.
I have 2 questions. First of all, have you ever met Serena Williams?
I have.
Oh,
she's
amazing.
awesome. I don't get starstruck like by people, but I was like, this is the most impressive woman in the world. And I just was like, she's so cool. Anyway.
And then second question is, you don't have to go into specifics on this, but what's like the biggest failure that you've seen from a company that's gone through YC, and what was the biggest thing that you learned from that?
So without naming names, I will say that the things that I've seen kill the most early stage companies are co-founder disputes. And it kills like every batch. There's probably a couple companies that you see co-founder breakups, and that can really kill a promising early stage company. And so that's why when we're interviewing, it's a really hard thing to interview for, but we look for like, what is that founder rapport? In the application we read, we have a question that asks like, what have you worked on together before? Like, what have you built together? Because ideally, it's not a team that just met 2 weeks ago. They've sort of either went to school together, worked at a company together, or even just did some side projects. We look for companies that have as close to equal equity as possible. So sometimes you'll see like someone say like, oh, I came up with the idea, so I have 80%, and my co-founder has 20%. And we always say, the vast majority of your company's life is in the future, right? It takes now 8 to 10 years is the average time to IPO or exit. So it's like this person, even though you came up with the idea and we're working on it maybe 3 to 6 months before this other person, like you should still have equal equity. So we see a lot of co-founder, dynamics issues, and then we see later on, a little bit later, we see burnout. Just like people who are like, I'm not as passionate about the space as I thought I was. I've been working 7 days a week for the past 2 years or 3 years, and I'm really tired of it. And then they just burn out. And so that's why we try to figure out when we're interviewing and reading applications, like what is it in this founder's background that makes them really interested in the space? That makes, like, do we believe that this person wants to work 10 years minimum on this project? Is it a problem that they, saw in their own life that they're solving, or do they have domain expertise in it? But that's a really also a tough thing to call when folks are so early stage. But those are probably the two things that we see kill the most companies, and it's always so like it's so sad for us because we're like, oh no, the company's dead now.
Other questions, Maya?
What are the most interesting industries companies are solving problems for that you've seen?
Ooh, that's hard. I mean, these days, it's so wide. Like we have like a number of aerospace companies, for example, and just like I've learned. So, okay, like I never thought I'd ever have to learn anything about, for example, like nuclear energy. Then we funded a nuclear fusion and a nuclear fission company, and I had to, like sort of learn really quickly about like, how to talk about it and how to think about it, and like why, this company was, chosen. We invested in them over the others, and so energy is really interesting. There are still so many, like I like the really weirdly like boring industries that are being, like that people are like starting to work in. Like I love PlanGrid, which is, sort of, the founder of PlanGrid, Tracy, is like this tiny woman who was a construction engineer, and she used to carry these 50-pound, like basically blueprints everywhere with her, and it would take weeks to ship them, so they'd be building a building, and then they'd get an updated plan, and they'd have to like, basically you just like demolish everything and start over again. And so she decided to put blueprints in the cloud so that you could, see them in real time, you could edit them in real time, people could share them, and of course you don't have to carry 50-pound blueprints with you. And so they're doing incredibly well. And I just think that's so exciting, is that she came from, an industry that is so old school, and it's hard to sell into those industries, of course, but she's really making a huge impact in that industry. So I like seeing those industries that like are unexpected, I guess.
Okay, well then, so what do you think has been over innovated? What's the one that they just keep? It's like, quit it already. There's nothing new.
I don't know that we're so early in the life cycle of technology in general. I don't think like there's any space that is like completely tapped out. And so like we started to notice like there's probably been a decrease in applications, or maybe like not right now, but maybe say like a year ago, in like consumer apps, and so we actually have a few interesting ones in this batch, and because we were like, I think VC was ignoring consumer apps for a while because they were like, oh, Snapchat, Facebook, it's all been done, but I think that it's cyclical. Mm-hmm. So I think that like we are coming upon a time where there'll probably be new consumer apps to think about, and people so I think that there are cycles. Right now, it's like everyone is like tired of chatbots. Like I think like people got burned out on chatbots. Mm-hmm. Everyone was building something on top of Slack for a while. It was like Slack bots, and that's also, I think, like people got tired of that. That's not to say that there still couldn't be like a huge company in that space, but it's like for a while people were super burned out on crypto and Bitcoin, but now you see like blockchain companies.
It's come back.
It's come back, and so I think like there isn't yet something that I would say is like totally solved. There was a lot of like HR tech, but there isn't even like I think there's still space in HR, for example, to like make things better.
Yeah.
Yes.
What kind of conversations about diversity and inclusion do you see happening with early stage startups?
So
Great question.
that is a good question, and because I think even when I started at YC in early 2013, it wasn't as talked about. I think the thought was like, oh, as an early stage startup, you shouldn't really be worried about this too much because you just have to survive. Like, get some funding so you can like live for another 6 months, and then once you like maybe raise an A or B or whatever, then you can really think about it. But I think the conversations of the past couple of years have showed us like, no, it is important to think about it, or at least be aware from the very beginning. And so I think of like diversity and inclusion as two different things. Diversity, and the way that I love, it's been described as like diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. So it's like diversity is more on the hiring and sourcing diverse candidates, whereas inclusion is more about culture. Like, and you can build culture starting from just when it's two people in a room. And so, being really intentional about like, how are we building this culture? Are we building a culture where everyone is going to be set up to do their best work? I think those are questions that founders can ask themselves really from the beginning. And so I think you're starting to see a lot more very, very early stage founders being really, intentional and thinking about these things when they hadn't before. We definitely get asked way more questions about it, about culture, about communication and co-founder dynamics and HR related questions. I think actually probably the Uber issues have like thrown it. It was already talked about a lot, but it's thrown it into super high relief. So I think it's been a really like it's an important time to figure out like, okay, how do we all move forward together and like in the right way.
Do you see, I know it's a little bit of a hot topic, but do you see what's happening the last month or so with a lot of, I guess, discussion, revealing, and exposure of what's happened with sexual harassment, assault? How do you see this playing out over the next couple months, the next couple of years?
So I'm really so thankful that a lot of the women who've like spoken publicly have come forward. I think it's made people aware that this is a widespread issue, and I wasn't even, to be honest, aware that it impacted as many women as it has. And so I am so glad that these topics are being discussed and brought up. Here, I think like some of the things that I worry about are that one, there's a lot of like, it's really negative and hard to talk about. There's so many stories about how hard it is to be a woman in tech, and so I worry that it'll dissuade a lot of really smart women from starting a company. They'll think like, I should just like be a professor, like go to med school or like something like that because it seems awful. And so I just want to not lose sight of the fact that there are thousands of investors that our companies have worked with, especially our female founders have worked with, thousands of investors who have supported women, who are very respectful, and they are out there. And so I guess I just wouldn't want all this, press to like dissuade people, because I still think we need more women starting companies. And then I also worry that you're going to see a lot of male investors sort of play it real safe and say like, I don't want to have like, any possibility of anything happening. I'm just going to like cut some of these like meetings I have with female founders, and or a couple female founders I've talked to have said a lot of deals happen sort of in informal environments, right? So over drinks, over dinner, and so to not have access to that is also really tough. So some people are like, well, maybe all meetings should take place in formal office environments, but the reality is like male founders go out to dinner and drinks, and that's where some deals get done.
Deals,
and it's,
right.
Yeah, and so it sucks to have investors close that option off for women. So I think it's a really tough. We're in like a transitional phase where people are going to figure out like, how do we make this process better for women, and how do we make sure that this never happens again, or how do we drastically decrease the incidents that happen. And but I don't think anyone has like real solution yet. I think but it is good that it's all like surfacing.
Do you think that this conversation will have a ripple effect in businesses outside of technology as well? Or do you think this is a Silicon
That's
Valley
interesting.
tech?
I think
Yeah.
that,
Because I think about like Hollywood.
yes,
What's the difference between what's happening here and an actress and a producer?
yes.
So, I mean, that world, I mean, that's a known situation. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Because I know you were also thinking about
Yeah.
being in the world of LA and Hollywood and being there, but I'm just curious, because sometimes things ripple, sometimes they don't.
I think it might. I think the reason why, you know, there's such a focus in tech is tech was supposed to be this like promised land, right? Everyone is this meritocratic place where, you know, if you just work hard, you can do well no matter who you are, no matter what your background came from. And I think we're all realizing that it's not necessarily true, right? There are still a lot of, you know, challenges that you have if you're, you know, non-white or not a white man. And so it's, I think those are coming to light. And so I think it's important to be really realistic about, like, but I think that's why people are really focused, because all of those industries are much older, and this was supposed to be like a new industry that changed everything, right? We were building this industry from scratch. So why is it stuck in the old paradigms? And so I think that's why there's been so much focus on tech and Silicon Valley, but I do think that, you know, yeah, the film industry has the same issue. You know, there are still, I'm sure, issues in finance and legal and all
Sure.
sorts of industries, and I'm curious to see how it'll impact. But in the near term, I think like a lot of the attention will stay on the tech industry.
Got it. That's great. Thank you for those insights. Anyone else? Creighton.
I'm curious how you think Sam Altman's doing as a spokesperson for YC.
I actually think Sam's one of the smartest people I work with, and he's typically really like he's like very smart and like usually very careful. I think sometimes, of course, like anyone, he has his moments. Like, yeah.
No, but he's been a great ambassador.
I think he's been great, and he's
for
been
YC.
some of the things that I think he's done have attracted just like incredible talent. Like he basically pioneered, you know, YC research, so that has gotten a lot of people in AI and you know, engineers and scientists and people who want to solve big problems. Really excited about, you know, what YC is doing, and he has really like huge visions for everything. Like he's, you know, incredibly smart. So I think it's been he's been really great at kind of identifying. And he also has gone and like, you know, he does a lot of research, like in the nuclear space, for example. He went out and recruited the nuclear companies because he, you know, it's something that I think he has a real vision of like what the future will look like, and like really goes after it aggressively.
Amazing. I still remember the Sam from Looped.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah, the old mobile days. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for your time,
thank you.
Kat. Really appreciate it.
How many companies at one time are you working with?
So right now we're working with 130.
You specifically?
YC is. So
Right,
there are
so-
130 companies in the program. And
Right.
so
You get a group of those?
So
that you would
they're
work with?
they're
So
split
working
up into
through?
5 groups.
Okay.
So it's so there's like 25 to 30 companies in a group, and then I work across all the groups. So not necessarily every single company will come to me, but like I work with